The anomaly, the chill in the grandmother's farmhouse in a village I'd never visited, clung to the walls like a second skin. It was an old dampness, smelling of wood smoke long extinguished, and something else, a faint, earthy mildew that no amount of ventilation seemed to dissipate. My breath plumed faintly in the early morning air as I hunched over the console, the glow of the screens painting my face in shifting shades of green and blue. The silence here was profound, broken only by the hum of my equipment and the occasional groan of the ancient house settling deeper into its foundations. I'd retreated to this place months ago, a self-imposed exile. The nearest neighbor was a mile down a winding, unpaved track, and the village itself was little more than a cluster of forgotten cottages. Perfect for what I did. No interruptions, no curious glances. Just me, the vast datasets I'd accumulated from the remote observatory, and the infinite, indifferent cosmos. My work was meticulous. I was searching for patterns, for anomalies, for anything that deviated from the expected cosmic background radiation. Most days were a monotonous grind of expected noise, a tapestry of predictable stellar nurseries and collapsing nebulae. The universe, in its grand scale, was largely a known quantity, a vast, elegant machine following immutable laws, or so I believed. This particular morning began like any other. The sun hadn't yet breached the horizon, leaving the world outside my window a study in indistinct grays. I'd brewed a strong, bitter coffee, the aroma cutting through the farmhouse's damp scent. My fingers danced across the keyboard, calling up the latest stream of data from the distant array. Gigabytes of information scrolled past, an endless river of telemetry and spectral analysis. I adjusted filters, refined algorithms, trying to tease out the faintest signal from the overwhelming static. My eyes, accustomed to the dim light, scanned the readouts, searching for the telltale spikes, the unexpected blips. Then there it was, a faint ripple almost imperceptible in a band of frequencies I rarely monitored with such intensity. It wasn't a burst, not a transient event. It was, sustained, my brow furrowed. I isolated the anomaly, routing it through a more sensitive array of processors. The farmhouse's generator, usually a subdued thrum, seemed to work a little harder, its vibration faintly resonating through the floorboards beneath my boots. The signal solidified, a slow, rhythmic pulse, too slow, too regular for any known astrophysical phenomenon. My scientific training screamed instrument error or terrestrial interference. I ran diagnostics, all systems green. I double-checked the filters, cross-referenced with previous scans. Nothing. No known celestial body in that sector should be emitting anything like this. I traced its origin point. The coordinates resolved to a region of intergalactic space, a vast, empty expanse between two galaxy clusters millions of light-years away. Nothing but the occasional rogue star or isolated gas cloud, and certainly nothing that could generate such a coherent, repeating pattern. My heart began to beat a little faster, a subtle flutter against my ribs. Not from fear, not yet. From the thrill of the chase, the intoxicating scent of genuine discovery. This was it, the moment I'd dedicated my life to. I spent the next several hours in a blur of focused activity, the bitter coffee long forgotten. I recalibrated, reprocessed, and reanalyzed. Each step confirmed the last. The signal was real, and it was structured. Not random noise, but a distinct sequence repeating every 34 seconds. A prime number, I noted, a flicker of an ancient human fascination with such things. If this was natural, it defied every principle of physics I understood. If it wasn't natural, I pulled up the spectral analysis. The signal was incredibly narrow-band, cutting through the cosmic background with an unnerving precision. It was too clean, too pure, and its age. My calculations, based on its distance and the expansion of the universe, put its origin at billions of years ago, far, far older than Earth, older than our sun, older than the very galaxy I called home. My determination, usually a steady flame, now flickered with a strange unease. The hum of the equipment seemed to take on a new, almost sinister undertone. I leaned closer to the main screen, my breath fogging the cool glass. The repeating pattern, now clearly visible, seemed to stare back at me. It wasn't complex, not overtly intelligent, but it was ordered, like a single, deliberate tap on a vast, silent drum. What kind of entity, what kind of force, could have tapped that drum across such impossible gulfs of space and time, and what was it trying to say? The old house groaned around me, a symphony of settling wood and whistling drafts. I hadn't seen my grandmother in years, not since I was a child. The news of her passing had arrived like a misplaced letter, unexpected and oddly distant. Her will, equally unexpected, had left me the farmhouse, a strange inheritance for a man who preferred the sterile hum of an observatory to the musty scent of forgotten things. But it was remote, utterly, beautifully remote. No light pollution, no stray radio frequencies, just the endless dark sky above the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited. I had hauled my entire setup here, piece by agonizing piece. The parabolic dish, disassembled and reassembled in the overgrown garden, now pointed its blank eye towards the heavens. Inside, the spare bedroom, its floral wallpaper peeling in strips like ancient parchment, had become my command center. Cables snaked across worn rugs, connecting the receiver to the server to my display. The low thrum of the cooling fans was the only constant sound, a mechanical heartbeat against the silence of the countryside. My initial calculations, that impossible age, had burrowed into my mind, a parasitic thought. Billions of years, before Earth, before our sun, how, why? I pushed those questions away, focusing on the signal itself. It was still there, unwavering, a faint whisper from the void. I needed to understand its structure. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. Coffee became a bitter lifeline. My eyes burned, tracing the spectral lines on the screen. The signal wasn't just narrowband, it was structured. Not random noise, not a natural phenomenon. It possessed a deliberate, almost elegant complexity. I started by searching for basic periodicity, simple repetitions, nothing obvious. But as I applied more advanced filtering algorithms, patterns began to emerge. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen. Not prime numbers, not Fibonacci sequences, not even the chaotic beauty of fractals. These were intricate arrangements of frequencies and amplitudes, shifting and reconfiguring in ways that defied known physics. Imagine a melody, but one where the notes weren't just tones, but entire orchestras, each instrument playing its own complex score, all harmonizing into something that was both alien and strangely compelling. My fingers trembled as I isolated a particularly dense sequence. It repeated, not exactly, but with subtle variations, like a theme in a musical composition that was constantly evolving. I tried linguistic analysis. Could it be a language? I fed segments into programs designed to detect syntax, phonemes, semantic structures. The results were gibberish, yet the programs registered an impossible density of information. Too much, far too much for any terrestrial language. It was as if every single word contained an entire library. The sheer economy of its coding was terrifying. The air in the room grew heavy, stale with my neglect. I forgot to eat, the hunger a distant ache. My skin felt clammy, my clothes sticking to me. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and haunted by abstract patterns, pulsing and shifting behind my eyelids. I'd wake with a gasp, the hum of the equipment a comfort and a torment. One evening, as the last sliver of sun bled out beyond the fields, painting the dusty window panes in hues of bruised purple, I found it. A meta-pattern. A pattern of patterns. The previously isolated sequences, which seemed random in their timing and appearance, were actually components of a larger, overarching design. It was like discovering that individual brushstrokes, seen up close, were meaningless, but stepping back revealed a vast, coherent mural. My breath hitched. This wasn't just intelligent. This was profoundly intelligent. An intelligence so far beyond our own. It made me feel like an insect staring at a star. This signal was billions of years old. It had been broadcasting before complex life even stirred in Earth's primordial oceans, and it was designed. My hands flew across the keyboard, calling up every data visualization I had. The patterns writhed on the screen, a mesmerizing, terrifying dance. There were layers upon layers, each revealing a deeper, more unsettling complexity. It wasn't just information. It felt like instruction. A blueprint, but a blueprint for what? A sudden sharp crack echoed from the floorboards beneath my feet. The old house or something within it shifted. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the window panes. Or was it the wind? My imagination, frayed by sleep deprivation and the sheer weight of this discovery, began to play tricks. Every creak, every rustle sounded amplified, sinister. I forced myself back to the screen. The signal pulsed. A silent, relentless beacon. It was communicating. It had been communicating for eons, and now I was listening, I was decoding. This wasn't a message to us. It was something else, something far more fundamental. The patterns coalesced, forming an abstract representation on the screen. It wasn't a picture, not a glyph, but a conceptual structure. It was a depiction of relationships, of fundamental principles. It was describing the very fabric of existence, but not as we understood it. It was like looking at the mathematical constants of the universe, but seeing them rendered in an entirely different, alien script. A script that implied a different set of rules. What if this wasn't a discovery of another civilization, but a revelation about the very nature of reality itself? And what if that revelation was something we were never meant to comprehend? What if I wasn't just decoding a message, but unraveling something far more ancient and dangerous? The hum of my equipment seemed to deepen, vibrating through the floorboards, through my very bones. I felt a profound sense of wrongness, as if the universe itself was subtly shifting around me, responding to the forbidden knowledge I was uncovering. What had I truly found? And what would happen when I finally understood it all? The air in the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited felt heavy, thick with the scent of aged paper and something vaguely mineral, like dust from old stone. Outside, the village was a collection of muted greens and grays, a place time had forgotten, much like the signal I'd been tracking. The news of her passing had brought me here, to this quiet corner of the world, but it was the impossible signal that truly held me captive. My equipment, refined and precise, sat silent in my makeshift lab back home, baffled. It offered no further insight, only the chilling confirmation, ancient, structured, impossible. I paced the creaking floorboards of the study, a room untouched for decades. My grandmother had been a quiet woman, reclusive in her later years, but the sheer volume of books lining these walls suggested a hidden life. Not scientific texts, not the kind of astrophysics journals I devoured, but leather-bound volumes, some with titles etched in faded gold leaf, others with no discernible markings at all. Many were in languages I couldn't immediately identify. I ran my fingers over a spine, rough and dry, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of weak sunlight that pierced the grimy window panes. My determination, usually focused on stellar cartography and quantum mechanics, had shifted. The signal wasn't just data anymore. It was a question, vast and terrifying, demanding an answer that my established scientific framework simply couldn't provide. I needed something else. Something older, something that predated human understanding of the cosmos, perhaps even predated what we thought we knew of humanity itself. The village, small as it was, held a single, unassuming shop on a narrow lane, its windows perpetually filmed with a fine layer of grime. A hand-painted sign, barely legible, read antiquarian. The bell above the door chimed with a mournful, tinny sound as I stepped inside, the sudden silence of the shop pressing in around me. It smelled of mildew, parchment, and something else, something sharp and metallic like old pennies. A figure emerged from behind a towering stack of atlases, a man with spectacles perched on the end of a long nose, his tweed jacket patched at the elbows. He moved with a deliberate slowness, his gaze assessing me with an unnerving intensity. "May I assist you?" he asked, his voice a dry rustle, like leaves skittering across pavement. I swallowed, the words feeling clumsy in my mouth. I'm looking for something specific, something very old, obscure. I paused, choosing my words carefully, structures that defy conventional explanation, from very far away and very, very old. The antiquarian's thin eyebrows rose infinitesimally. He didn't scoff, didn't dismiss me. Instead, he simply nodded, a slow, thoughtful movement. Patterns, I say, structures, we have many such things. Records of things seen, things imagined, things perhaps, both. He gestured vaguely to the labyrinthine shelves that seemed to stretch into perpetual twilight. What kind of patterns are we speaking of? Celestial, geological, metaphysical, cosmic, I clarified, a tremor in my voice I tried to suppress. Beyond the known cosmos, a kind of impossible geometry. His gaze sharpened. I speak of the unwritten laws then, the deeper currents. He turned, and without another word, led me deeper into the dusty maze. We navigated narrow aisles, past crumbling folios and scrolls tied with brittle ribbon. Each step felt like a descent, not just into the back of a shop, but into something far more ancient. He eventually stopped before a section of shelves almost hidden by a leaning stack of wooden crates. "These," he announced, sweeping a hand across the row, "are the texts less frequently disturbed, the ones whose contents are less palatable to the modern mind. Accounts of the pre-human, of the forgotten. My fingers trembled as I began to pull books from the shelves. Most were indecipherable, their scripts alien, their illustrations grotesque. This wasn't just dusty research. It felt like tampering with something best left buried. The air grew heavy, like a storm front pressing down, but the only sound was the rustle of turning pages and my own ragged breathing. Then I found it. A slender, leather-bound volume, its cover plain, its pages brittle and yellowed. The script inside was dense, archaic, yet somehow familiar in its structure, a language I felt I should know but couldn't quite grasp. But it wasn't the text that froze me. It was the diagram. Rendered in crude, faded ink, it depicted a swirling vortex, not of water or air, but of pure, incomprehensible form. It was a chaotic symmetry, a geometry that defied Euclidean space, yet possessed an undeniable, terrifying order. And around this central form, faint, almost imperceptible lines radiated outward, forming a complex, resonant lattice. My breath hitched. It was a perfect, horrifying match. The impossible pattern, the structured anomaly, the very signature of the signal I had detected, was laid bare on these ancient pages, not as a scientific schematic, but as an occult symbol, a forbidden sigil. Not as a signal, of course, but as a presence. This wasn't just a myth, it was a record. A warning. The signal wasn't just an anomaly, it was a beacon, a calling card. And humanity, in its scientific hubris, had only just begun to listen. What was I dealing with? What impossible entity had these ancient, forgotten people glimpsed and recorded in a language of fear? My stomach churned. A profound, icy dread seeped into my bones, chilling me to the marrow. A warning. I packed without thought, shoving clothes and my most crucial research notes into a worn duffel bag. The hum of the lab, once a comforting lull, now felt like a predatory thrum, a vibration against my teeth. I needed distance, a place where the air didn't feel so thick with unseen pressures. The only place that came to mind was my grandmother's farmhouse in a village I'd never visited, a forgotten address tucked away in an old photo album. It was remote, quiet, and most importantly, disconnected. No high-tech equipment, no immediate access to the instruments that had brought this terror to my doorstep. The journey was a blur of highway lines and simmering anxiety. The old farmhouse stood sentinel on a windswept hill, its windows like vacant eyes. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of pale sunlight, illuminating forgotten furniture draped in white sheets. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of aged wood and dried lavender. I cleared a small space in the kitchen, setting up my old laptop, its processing power a fraction of what I was used to, but enough for analysis, for rechecking the data. I told myself it was for a fresh perspective, but the truth was I was running. The first distortion was trivial, easily dismissed. I had placed my chipped ceramic mug, half full of cooling tea, on the kitchen counter beside the sink. I turned to rummage for a sugar packet in a cupboard. When I turned back, mug wasn't there. My gaze swept the counter, then the small, rustic table. Nothing. A prickle of annoyance flared. Had I put it down somewhere else? I was tired, sleep-deprived. My hand brushed against the shelf above the sink where a stack of old, unused plates rested. There, nestled amongst them, was my mug. It was upright, not spilled, as if it had simply walked there. I blinked. No, I must have put it there myself, absent-mindedly. Exhaustion played tricks. I retrieved it, the ceramic warm beneath my fingers, and tried to forget the brief, unsettling moment. Days bled into a week. The farmhouse offered no solace, only a different kind of quiet, one that amplified the subtle shifts. I found my worn leather journal, where I meticulously recorded my thoughts and findings, open to a random page, though I distinctly remembered closing it and leaving it on the bedside table. Later, a small, polished river stone I'd picked up from the path outside vanished from the windowsill, only to reappear hours later, sitting squarely in the middle of a dusty, unused chessboard in the living room. Each instance was minor, explainable with a stretch of logic, a lapse in memory, an accidental nudge, the settling of an old house. But the cumulative effect was beginning to chafe at the edges of my rational mind. Then the geometry started. It began with fleeting glimpses, like static on a screen. The corner of the kitchen doorframe, for a fraction of a second, seemed to bend inward, the lines converging at an impossible angle before snapping back to normal. I would rub my eyes, convinced it was an optical illusion, a trick of the light playing on my tired retinas. But these moments grew more frequent, more insistent. The pattern on an old Persian rug would momentarily ripple, not with movement, but with a sudden, wrong alignment of its threads, creating a motif that didn't belong, a strange, recursive knot that made my vision swim. My breath would catch. I'd stare, waiting for it to return, but it would always be gone, leaving behind only the dull, familiar weave. Sleep offered no escape. My dreams became a churning vortex of impossible spaces and silent screams. I would witness things shift, entire landscapes folding in on themselves like crumpled paper, mountains resolving into plains, rivers flowing upstream into the sky. My head throbbed. One morning, after a particularly vivid dream of an impossible cube rotating through dimensions I couldn't grasp, I walked into the small, unused study. On the antique writing desk, amidst layers of dust, sat a single, perfectly formed octahedron of clear quartz. It hadn't been there the night before. I knew because I had wiped that very spot clean, hoping to set up a secondary workspace. It gleamed, catching the weak morning light, its facets unnaturally sharp, almost too perfect. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. The stone was cool, smooth, utterly alien in its sudden appearance. It hummed with a faint internal vibration, a frequency I could almost feel rather than hear. Where had it come from? What was it? The subtle distortions were no longer subtle. They were personal. They were reaching into my isolation, into the very fabric of my immediate world. The signal, I realized with a fresh wave of nausea, wasn't merely a record or a beacon. It was an instruction, and something was listening, not just to the signal, but to me. It was learning the contours of my reality, preparing to reshape it. What would it touch next? The world outside my window blurred into a smear of greens and grays. The familiar cityscape had long since vanished, replaced by winding country roads and the occasional, isolated farm. My hands, clammy and trembling, gripped the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity that spoke of something far beyond mere fatigue. I was fleeing, not from pursuit, but from the unbearable weight of what I now knew. The signal wasn't just a record, it was a testament, a dire warning etched into the fabric of the cosmos. And I, in my blind pursuit of knowledge, had stumbled upon the very edge of an abyss. My destination was the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited, a place chosen out of desperation. A vague memory from a dusty file I'd found among the discarded papers of a disgraced former academic. He was the only one, according to the cryptic notes, who had dared to theorize about such things, about existence not as a given, but as a fragile, potentially temporary construct. My own colleagues, if I even dared to approach them, would brand me mad. But madness felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. Not when the universe itself seemed to be whispering secrets that promised to unmake everything. The village was a collection of crumbling stone and faded paint, huddled together against a relentless, indifferent landscape. A single, crooked sign, its letters barely legible, marked the entrance. The air here was heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, a faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place. It felt ancient, settled, as if time moved differently in this forgotten corner of the world. My rental car, a jarringly modern intrusion, rattled over the uneven cobblestones, drawing the curious, unblinking stares of a few figures hunched by a pub doorway. I drove past the village square, past the small, silent church, following the sparse directions scribbled on a napkin. The farmhouse was set apart, perched on a low rise overlooking fields that stretched to a bruised horizon. It was a skeletal structure of weathered timber and cracked plaster, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at nothing. A single, rusted mailbox leaned precariously by the gate, its flag long since broken. The path leading to the front door was overgrown with weeds, suggesting years of neglect. My stomach tightened. This was it. The only sound was the rustle of dry leaves in the wind and the distant, mournful cry of some unseen bird. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. What was I doing here? What could a reclusive, disgraced academic, branded a lunatic, possibly tell me that my decades of scientific rigor couldn't? I pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust, old paper, and something acrid like burnt sugar mixed with ozone. Hello, my voice, rough and uncertain, sounded alien in the quiet, a shuffle from deeper within the house. Then, a figure emerged from the gloom of a cluttered living room. He was a man of indeterminate age, his face a roadmap of deep lines, his hair a wild, unkempt white halo. His eyes, though, were what seized me. They were sharp, almost predatory, but also held a profound weariness, a knowledge that seemed to have etched itself onto his very soul. He wore a threadbare robe, clutched tight around his gaunt frame. "Marcus," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He didn't ask how I knew his name or why I was here. He simply knew. "I've been expecting my breath caught in my throat. Expecting me how? And I have been listening very intently indeed. Come in." The living room was a chaotic jumble of books, stacks of yellowed papers, and strange, hand-drawn diagrams tacked to the walls. I sat, my muscles stiff with apprehension. "So," he began, settling into another armchair, his gaze fixed on me. "I've heard it, haven't I? The one they dismissed as cosmic background noise or some mathematical anomaly." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "They never listened, structured, ancient, impossible. I've heard the echoes of the great unraveling. The correction, the word felt like a stone in my mouth. Yes, they call it that. Not a destruction, not an invasion, but a reordering. A fundamental adjustment of what is. Imagine a tapestry, Marcus, billions of threads woven over unimaginable eons. And then a hand reaches in not to tear it, but to snip out certain threads, to realign others, to change the very pattern of its existence. It does not destroy the tapestry, it changes it. Humanity, life, the very laws of physics as we understand them. We are the threads that were woven incorrectly, and the signal. That's the sound of the loom being prepared. Not beings in any sense I could comprehend. Not alive, not dead, not matter, not energy. They are the fundamental architects, the cosmic sensors. They exist outside of our reality, yet they define it. And they're waking up, or rather they're becoming aware of the dissonance, the anomaly that is us. My mind reeled. This wasn't just abstract theory. His words felt like a direct, undeniable truth. The signal, the impossible structure, the terrifying implications, they all clicked into place with a horrifying precision. So, the signal, a resonance from a reality that was deemed incorrect and ceased to be. I've heard the death rattle of a universe, Marcus, and now I rare hearing the prelude to our own. He paused, his gaze boring into me. They don't hate us. They don't even know us. We are merely a flaw in their grand design. A cosmic typo that must be erased for the sake of universal harmony. And I, Marcus, by listening, have drawn their attention to the typo. Do I understand what I've done? The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. My hands clenched, nails digging into my palms. The farmhouse, the village, the entire world outside seemed to shrink and become insignificant, dwarfed by the incomprehensible scale of what he described. My scientific curiosity, once a beacon, now felt like a curse. I had opened a door, and through it, something vast and indifferent was beginning to stir. What horrors had I truly unleashed? The air in the room, thick with the scent of old wood and something vaguely metallic from my equipment, still pressed in on me. My scientific curiosity, once a beacon, now felt like a flickering candle in a hurricane. I was in the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited, surrounded by the ghosts of a life I'd never known. Yet my focus remained locked on the impossible signal. The previous revelation, delivered by the stranger, had stripped away any lingering hope of a conventional explanation. This was not a natural phenomenon, something more. I pushed the dread down, forcing myself to concentrate. Determination, brittle but present, was my only anchor. The raw data streamed across my monitors, a cascade of abstract symbols and fluctuating waveforms. For days, I had treated it as a puzzle, a supremely complex encryption. I had applied every known algorithm, every permutation of mathematical and linguistic analysis I could conceive. The signal resisted, mocking my efforts with its intricate, yet utterly alien coherence. It was structured undeniably, but the structure defied human logic. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford, a weakness I couldn't indulge. My eyes burned, gritty behind my spectacles. The coffee, cold and bitter in the mug beside me, did little to sharpen my focus. I leaned closer to the screen, adjusting the filters, trying to isolate recurring patterns. My fingers, stained with ink from frantic note-taking, hovered over the keyboard. Then, a subtle shift. I had been trying to force the signal into a framework of binary code, of digital packets, of something understandable. But what if it wasn't meant to be understood in that way? I began to approach it not as a message, but as an expression. I slowed the playback, stretched the waveforms, amplified the subtle harmonic variations. A low resonance began to emerge, not a sound I could hear with my ears, but a vibration that seemed to settle in the very bones of my skull. It started as a faint pressure behind my eyes, then spread, a dull throb that pulsed in time with the signal's rhythm. The air in the room seemed to thicken, growing heavy, like breathing underwater. The symbols on my screen, previously a chaotic dance of alien glyphs, began to coalesce. They didn't form words, not in any language I knew, but rather conceptual clusters. Each cluster vibrated with an implicit meaning, a terrifyingly vast idea. It was like seeing the underlying architecture of thought itself, stripped bare of human metaphor or context. I saw, or rather felt, notions of immense age. Not millennia, not even epochs, but stretches of time so deep they rendered stellar life cycles as fleeting blinks. This entity had witnessed the birth and death of galaxies. It had existed before stars ignited, before matter coalesced. The sheer scale of its existence was a crushing weight on my mind, threatening to flatten my own meager sense of self. The resonance deepened. It wasn't just data anymore. It was imbued with intent. I began to pick out repeating motifs, not just visually but experientially. A sense of correction, a need for order, but this order was not human order. It was a cosmic fundamental reordering. It was a blueprint for an existence beyond our comprehension, a reality where our laws, our physics, our very understanding of causality might simply be obsolete. My breath hitched. My hands, still hovering over the keyboard, began to tremble. This wasn't a discovery, it was an invasion. The signal wasn't just transmitting, it was imparting. It was less like deciphering a message and more like being sung into existence by an alien consciousness. A song of creation, perhaps, but one that would unmake everything I knew. The pressure in my head intensified, a dull ache blooming into a sharp, piercing pain. My vision blurred at the edges, the lines of code on the screen seeming to writhe and contort. I closed my eyes, but the internal resonance continued, a deep, guttural hum that vibrated through my chest. It was a primal sound, older than sound itself, carrying with it the weight of unimaginable eons. It felt as though the entity wasn't merely broadcasting, it was speaking directly into the folds of my brain, not with words, but with pure, unadulterated concepts, resonating directly with my consciousness. I was an antenna, a receiver, being tuned to a frequency that was never meant for human ears. A fragment of its purpose solidified in my mind, an awful crystalline truth. It sought to undo, to rewrite, to correct the very fabric of the universe, not out of malice, but out of an alien, incomprehensible logic. Our reality, our existence, was merely a flawed equation in its grand, terrifying calculation. My throat was dry, raw. What was I listening to? And how much of its terrible song had already burrowed into me? I was in the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited, surrounded by artifacts of a life I barely knew, and a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. I tried to focus. The signal, that impossible whisper from the void, had not ceased. It had woven itself into the fabric of my days, a persistent hum beneath the surface of my thoughts. I had spent hours staring at the console, at the jagged lines and impossible symmetries, trying to find a pattern, a mathematical elegance that would explain away the growing unease. My eyes burned. The old rocking chair in the corner seemed to lean forward, its wooden frame groaning faintly, as if settling into a new predatory posture. Was it the wood contracting in the cool night air, or something else entirely? I reached for my mug, my fingers brushing against the ceramic, cool and smooth. But as I lifted it, the surface seemed to ripple, the glaze shifting like disturbed water. The floral pattern, a faded rose, elongated, its petals stretching into thin, skeletal fingers grasping at the rim. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. The mug was normal, solid, the rose pattern perfectly intact. A hallucination, a trick of the light, a symptom of exhaustion. It had to be. The farmhouse creaked around me, a symphony of settling timber and groaning floorboards. Each sound, once a comforting echo of age, now felt like a deliberate movement. The scent of dust and ancient linen, usually faint, sharpened, taking on a strange, almost metallic edge, like old blood mixed with ozone. I wiped my palms on my trousers. My skin felt too tight, my scalp prickled. I had been alone here for weeks, isolated by my work, by the growing chasm between my understanding of the cosmos and the horrifying reality the signal was presenting. How much of this new sensitivity was genuine, and how much was simply the frayed edge of my own mind unraveling? The signal was playing in my headphones, a low, rhythmic thrum, almost subliminal. I had set it to a barely audible level, a constant companion. Now it felt like a vibration inside my skull, not just in my ears. I saw the old grandfather clock in the hall, its pendulum swinging with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound was off, slightly asynchronous with the visual swing. My gaze snagged on the polished wood of its case. For a moment, the grain seemed to deepen, to swirl, forming intricate, impossible patterns that pulsed with a faint internal luminescence. The patterns resolved into something like ancient script, alien and incomprehensible, yet profoundly disturbing. My vision swam. I blinked hard, rubbing my temples. Had it ever even ticked? I couldn't remember hearing it before. Truly, I stood, my knees unsteady, and walked towards the window overlooking the overgrown garden. The skeletal branches of the apple tree clawed at the pane. It was formless, yet possessed a terrible gravity, a sense of immense watchful presence. My breath caught in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribs, a frantic drum against bone. I pressed my face closer to the cold glass, straining to discern details in the absolute blackness. There was nothing. Later, much later, I found myself pacing the narrow hallway. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, each creak amplified in the suffocating quiet. I passed a framed photograph on the wall, a sepia-toned image of my grandmother, younger, smiling, standing in front of this very farmhouse. I paused, my gaze drawn to her eyes. They seemed to follow me. A trick of the light, of course, the angle of the lens. But then, as I stared, the smile on her face seemed to falter, to stretch into something strained, almost pained. Her eyes, once warm, seemed to deepen, to fill with an ancient, weary sorrow that made my stomach clench. It spoke a word I did not recognize, a sound that felt more like a concept than a phonetic utterance. It was a word that conveyed utter, desolate emptiness. I snatched the photograph from the wall, my fingers fumbling with the brass hook. It clattered to the floor, glass shattering with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent house. I stared at the broken shards, at the fractured image of her face. The sorrow in her eyes was gone, replaced by the blankness of a shattered memory. Had the signal, the entity, always been there, subtly reshaping the edges of my reality, even before I had detected its impossible message? There was this house, this quiet village, merely a stage set, meticulously altered for my benefit or my torment. I was in the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited, surrounded by an isolation that had become less a comfort and more a cage. The signal, that impossible whisper from the void, had reshaped my world. It had also, I was beginning to understand, reshaped this world. It started subtly. A slight tremor beneath my feet, not enough to rattle the window panes, but a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I dismissed it initially. A fault in the old farmhouse's foundation, perhaps a passing heavy vehicle on the distant road. But the village was remote, the road rarely trafficked, and the hum persisted, a low, almost infrasonic thrum that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of my equipment, nor the sigh of the wind through the tall, skeletal trees outside. This was something else. My makeshift lab, crammed into what must have been the grandmother's sitting room, was a chaotic tableau of wires, screens, and blinking lights. I had modified some of my more sensitive instruments, attempting to trace the hum to give it form. My old seismograph, meant for geological studies, registered a faint, erratic pulse, completely divorced from any known seismic activity. The needle danced, not in sharp spikes, but in a slow, undulating rhythm that spoke of immense, distant pressure. Then came the light. It wasn't a sudden burst, but a deepening of the twilight that seeped through the grime-streaked windows. The sky outside, already bruised purple and gray, took on a peculiar luminescence, like the inside of a bruised fruit. It pulsed, a faint, sickly glow that seemed to breathe. I watched it, my breath catching in my throat, my hand involuntarily reaching for the heavy wooden frame of the window. The light wasn't coming from the sun, which had long set, nor from any moon. It was the sky itself, glowing. I felt a strange lightness in my limbs, not a pleasant buoyancy, but a disorienting sensation, as if the very ground beneath me had grown less substantial. I dropped a heavy wrench from my grasp, expecting its usual satisfying thud against the floorboards. Instead, it fell with an unnerving slowness, a deliberate descent that seemed to defy the natural order. It landed with a muted clack, not the sharp report I was accustomed to. My stomach lurched, a cold knot tightening in my gut. I tried to walk, and my steps felt oddly weighted, then suddenly light, as if gravity itself was fluctuating, a fickle, unseen hand toying with me. My head swam. I leaned against a cluttered workbench, the cold metal biting into my palm. This wasn't just a signal anymore. This was physical. This was here. The entity, or whatever incomprehensible force it represented, was no longer merely communicating. It was exerting influence. It was altering the very fabric of my immediate reality. My instruments screamed silently. The atmospheric pressure gauges I'd set up, rudimentary but functional, swung wildly, then settled on impossible readings. The air, already thick with the scent of ozone and something indefinably acrid, now felt heavy, then thin, as if I was breathing through water, then through nothing at all. My ears popped, repeatedly, a dull, persistent ache behind my sinuses. I tasted copper on my tongue. I needed to see. I needed to know if this impossible phenomenon was confined to the farmhouse or if it gripped the world beyond. I fumbled with the rusted bolt, my fingers clumsy and numb. The air, though still, felt as if it was being stretched, warped. It carried the smell of wet earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something sharp and metallic, like static electricity mixed with blood. But it was the sight that truly froze me. The trees, the familiar, gnarled silhouettes I had watched for weeks, were subtly wrong. Their branches, skeletal against the glowing sky, seemed to sway not with the wind, but with an unnatural, slow rhythm, as if caught in a current of invisible water. The ground, too, seemed to undulate, a barely perceptible ripple across the damp grass. My eyes strained against the sickly purple light. I saw the distant line of hills, usually a solid, unwavering presence on the horizon. But tonight they shimmered, their outlines blurring, then sharpening, as if viewed through a distorted pane of ancient glass. It was like looking at a poorly rendered image, a glitch in the very landscape. The hum in my bones intensified, vibrating up through my teeth, making my vision blur. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to steady myself, to anchor myself to something solid, something real. But reality was dissolving around me. The entity wasn't just transmitting knowledge of its existence, it was bringing its existence here. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate bird trapped in a cage. My breath hitched. The air, now thick and viscous, seemed to resist my lungs. This wasn't a distant observation anymore. This was an invasion, a fundamental alteration. What laws of existence was it unraveling, and how close was it to unmaking me? I was in the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited, surrounded by the unsettling quiet of a place long abandoned by anything but dust and memory. The silence hummed, a low, barely perceptible vibration that felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence holding its breath. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and data, now felt like a sieve, leaking sanity with every passing moment. My hands trembled as I traced the edge of the antique wooden table. The signal, the entity, the impending unraveling, it was all too much to bear alone. I had to speak. I had to warn them. The world needed to know. I pulled out my satellite phone, its plastic casing cool against my clammy palm. The signal was always weak out here, a fragile thread connecting me to a reality that felt increasingly distant. I dialed the number of a colleague, a theoretical physicist whose intellect I respected, whose skepticism I knew would be formidable. The phone rang, a tinny, hollow sound in the vast silence of the farmhouse. Each ring seemed to amplify my own frantic pulse. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, utterly normal. It was a sound from another world. "It's Marcus," I said, my voice hoarse, a dry rasp in my throat. I tried to project calm, to sound rational, but the words felt like pebbles in my mouth. I need to tell I something urgent, something critical." There was a pause, a slight hesitation. "Marcus, where are I? We've been trying to reach I. My lab is, well, it's a mess, and my research." The colleague's tone was carefully neutral, but I could hear the underlying concern, tinged with something else, suspicion, perhaps. "I'm at the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited," I blurted, location feeling surreal even as I spoke it. "It's not important where I am. What matters is what I've found, the signal. It's not just a signal, it's a presence, an entity. It's real and it's here, or it will be. It's unraveling things, the fundamental laws. It's a correction, an erasure. I could hear a sigh on the other end, a slow, deliberate exhalation. Marcus, I understand I've been under immense pressure. This project, it's been consuming. We all saw it. No. I shouted, the word echoing in the empty room, startling me with its ferocity. My grip tightened as I gripped the phone tighter. I don't understand. This isn't stress. This isn't a breakdown. This is reality. It's shifting. I've seen it. The patterns, the impossible geometries, the way the stars, they're not quite right anymore. Marcus, the colleague's voice was softer now, laced with a pity that felt like a venomous insult. Listen to myself. Impossible geometries. Stars not quite right. This sounds like, well, it sounds like I need to take a break. A real one. Come back to the city. They thought I was mad. No, you have to listen. It's watching, it's acting, and it's not just observing, it's changing everything. This isn't a theory, it's an observation. The data confirms it. I have the readings, the anomalous fluctuations. They are subtle, but they are accelerating. Marcus, the data you sent us before you disappeared, it was fragmented, inconclusive. Frankly, it looked like noise. Highly suggestive noise, perhaps, but noise nonetheless. And now this. You're talking about cosmic entities. That's not science, Marcus. That's my jaw clenched. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, a frantic roar. Please, I pleaded, my voice cracking, the determination giving way to a raw, desperate fear. Ira, the only one who might believe me. We have to warn everyone. This isn't about humanity's survival in the usual sense. It's about existence itself, the very fabric of being. Marcus, the colleague said, their voice firm now, decisive. I'm going to advise I to power down my equipment, come back and let us help If I don't, I'm afraid we'll have to consider this an unfortunate incident. My research will be put on hold, indefinitely. The dial tone that followed was like a physical blow. They had hung up. They didn't believe me. They thought I was broken. I tried another number, a more senior figure, someone known for their open-mindedness, their willingness to challenge paradigms. The senior figure listened for a few minutes, their responses clipped, punctuated by long pauses. They cut me off mid-sentence, mentioning unsubstantiated claims and professional integrity. They warned me against spreading misinformation that could undermine public trust in scientific institutions. The receiver clicked before I could even begin to argue. My hands fell to my sides, the satellite phone slipping from my grasp to clatter softly on the worn floorboards. A dull ache throbbed behind my eyes. The air in the farmhouse, already thick, seemed to congeal, pressing down on me, suffocating. I was utterly alone. I walked to the dusty window, peering out at the untamed garden. I squinted, trying to discern if it was merely the fading light or something else. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the ground beneath my feet, a resonance that had nothing to do with the wind. The world was still there, physically, but the subtle shifts I'd been detecting were no longer confined to my instruments. They were seeping into the very perception of reality around me. The dismissal, the polite but firm rejection, had not diminished the threat. It had merely isolated me with it. The entity, the signal, the unraveling, it was still happening, whether anyone believed me or not. And now, there was no one left to tell. What was the true cost of being the only one who saw? The dial tone still echoed in my ears, a dead sound that had been a physical blow. They had hung up. They didn't believe me. This time, the conversation was shorter, colder. My words, once carefully chosen, now sounded like the ravings of a stranger, even to my own ears. I knew then that I was alone, completely, terrifyingly alone. I retreated, not to my apartment, not to the observatory. I needed to disappear, to process, to simply be somewhere else before I shattered. I drove for hours, the hum of the tires on the asphalt a monotonous drone against the frantic thrumming behind my ribs. My destination was a place I'd only heard about in faded photographs and hushed anecdotes. My grandmother's farmhouse in a village I've never visited. It was a desperate choice, an instinctual pull towards something ancient and forgotten, a place where, perhaps, the world might still make sense. The house itself was a silent sentinel, nestled amidst fields that stretched into a gray horizon. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of sunlight, piercing the grime-streaked windows. The air inside was heavy with the scent of old wood, dried lavender, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet that I couldn't place. It clung to the fabrics, seeped into my skin. I wandered through the silent rooms, each one a testament to a life lived long ago, untouched by the accelerating strangeness of my own. The quiet should have been a comfort, a balm. Instead, it felt like a vacuum, waiting to be filled by something terrible. My hands trembled as I unpacked the few things I'd brought. I was here, but what was I hiding from? Days blurred into a single, extended twilight. I tried to make sense of my notes, the impassable signal data, the escalating anomalies I'd observed. My mind circled the drain of what I knew, what I suspected, what I now feared. The world outside the farmhouse seemed to dim, its edges softening, blurring. I found myself staring at the fields, the distant line of trees, and noticing how the light seemed to bend around them not quite right. A tree in the distance, a gnarled oak, appeared to shift its position slightly between blinks, just a fraction, a trick of light or tired eyes. I dismissed it. I had to. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, ragged sound. Was I truly seeing things, or was something else beginning to see me? The old radio in the kitchen, crackling with static, became my only link to the wider world. I'd tune in, desperate for news, for any sign that I wasn't losing my grip. At first, it was just background noise, reports of minor tremors, unusual weather patterns. Then, the stories began to change. A news anchor, usually unflappable, stammered through a report about a newly discovered mountain range in the Sahara, its peaks impassably sharp, its geometry defying all known geological principles. My blood ran cold, not in a cliché, but as a chilling wave that tightened the skin on my scalp. This wasn't just a mountain. This was an impossibility. The reports escalated. A small town in South America, its entire main street now curving inward at both ends. The buildings tilting at angles that should have sent them crashing down. The images flashed across the tiny, flickering screen of the old television I'd managed to get working. They didn't understand it. They couldn't articulate it, but I knew. I felt it too, a resonating echo of the signal, a cosmic vibration that was now permeating the very fabric of existence. My stomach churned, a knot of pure ice. How could something so vast, so alien, exert such a precise, terrifying influence? Then came the disappearances. Not just individuals, but entire small communities. A remote fishing village in Norway, its docks empty, its boats adrift, not a single soul found. The official explanations were vague, unsatisfying mass migration, freak accidents. But the tone of the announcers, the subtle tremor in their voices, spoke of something far more sinister. I pressed my hands against my temples, a dull ache throbbing behind my eyes. The world wasn't just changing, it was being rewritten. The fundamental laws, the bedrock of our reality, were coming undone. Was this what the signal had portended? A cosmic correction, an unraveling of everything we understood. I sat in the dim living room, the radio's crackle the only sound, the air thick with the metallic sweet scent that now seemed to intensify with each passing moment. But as I watched, the outline of the tree seemed to waver, its branches momentarily twisting into shapes that were sharp, angular, not organic. It was a fleeting distortion, a blink-and-you-miss-it anomaly, but it was enough. My breath hitched. The entity wasn't just influencing distant landscapes anymore. It was here, in the quiet village, in the grandmother's farmhouse in village I've never visited. What would happen when the last barrier finally gave way? They had hung up. This time, the conversation had been brief, laced with a polite pity that felt colder than outright dismissal. He spoke of rest, of perspective, of the strain my work had placed upon me. I heard the unspoken words in his cadence, delusional, unhinged, dangerous. He'd suggested a place, a quiet retreat, far from the observatory, far from everything. He had even offered to arrange it. I had hung up on him then, the receiver clattering against its cradle like a bone snapping. There was nowhere left to go, no one left to tell. The world, my world, had sealed itself off, a smooth, impenetrable surface, so I drove. I drove until the city lights were smudges in my rearview mirror, until the roads narrowed into forgotten paths, until the air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something I couldn't place. I drove until I found myself in the village I'd never visited, the one my mother had spoken of only in hushed tones, where my grandmother's farmhouse stood, a relic of a time before my own. The farmhouse was a skeletal outline against the bruised twilight sky when I finally pulled into the gravel drive. Dust motes danced in the last, weak rays of sunlight filtering through the grimy windows, illuminating a silence that felt older than the house itself. The air inside was heavy, smelling of mildew, dried lavender, and something indefinably metallic, like old blood or rusted iron. Each floorboard groaned beneath my weight, a mournful lament that echoed my own internal ache. I moved through the empty rooms, my footsteps alien in the stillness. I found myself in what must have been the sitting room, a space crammed with forgotten furniture draped in white sheets that looked like shrouds. The window overlooked a field, now just a canvas of deepening gray. My eyes, no longer just seeing, began to perceive. The faint hum that had lived at the edge of my hearing for weeks intensified, becoming a low thrum that vibrated through my bones. It wasn't a sound from outside. It was inside, in the walls, in the air, in the very fabric of my being. The metallic tang in the air grew sharper, a taste on my tongue. I felt the dimensions around me shift, subtly at first, like a sheet rippling in an unfelt breeze. The angles of the room, once so reassuringly 90 degrees, seemed to soften, to stretch, to buckle in ways that defied visual logic. My mind, stripped raw by weeks of isolation and impossible data, no longer resisted. It simply absorbed. Then it came. Not a vision in the conventional sense, not something that could be painted or sculpted. It was a complete unraveling of perception, a shattering of the three-dimensional cage I had called reality. I saw, or rather understood, lines that curved back on themselves without intersecting, surfaces that contained infinite depth, points that were simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. It was a geometry of utter impossibility, a form composed of contradictions, a non-Euclidean nightmare made manifest through the distortion of my own senses. My vision swam, not with images, but with concepts that rearranged themselves faster than I could process. The very air shimmered, not with heat, but with an incomprehensible pressure, as if the space itself was being squeezed and stretched, folded in upon itself. It wasn't a creature. It was a fundamental shift in the rules of being. My skin crawled, not from fear, but from the unbearable sensation of my own cellular structure trying to reconcile itself with the impossible geometries I was perceiving. My breath caught in my throat, my lungs refusing to expand in a space that no longer adhered to consistent physical laws. My fingers twitched, desperate to grasp something solid, something real, but even the floor beneath me felt like a shifting, liquid surface, and with this horrifying, clear vision came the understanding of its purpose. It was not malicious, not vengeful, it simply was. Our reality, our universe, with its elegant but finite laws, was an anomaly, a flaw, a mistake to be corrected. This entity, this impossible geometry of pure concept, existed to smooth out the wrinkles, to realign the fundamental constants, to bring all existence into conformity with its own alien logic. It sought to correct reality, to erase the imperfections it perceived, and in doing so, erase everything we understood, everything we were. Our existence was a deviation, and the signal, that impossible, ancient hum, was its harbinger. A tuning fork struck against the fabric of our universe, preparing it for an irreversible reharmonization. The correction wasn't an act of destruction, but of reordering, a profound, cosmic reorganization that would leave no trace of our familiar laws, our cherished dimensions, our very concept of self. We were simply an error in a vast, indifferent equation. My mind, already frayed, could not contain the weight of this truth. It buckled, shattered, yet through the fragments, I saw with an awful clarity. The entity wasn't coming to conquer, it was coming to fix. And its fix would be our oblivion. The farmhouse creaked again, a long, drawn-out sound that could have been the wind, or it could have been the groan of matter itself, as the edges of reality began to blur. Was I truly seeing, or merely succumbing to the final, terrifying delusion of a broken mind? They had hung up. This time, the conversation was shorter, punctuated by strained silences and the rustle of papers on the other end, before a polite but firm dismissal. They saw a man unraveling, not a warning. I had nowhere left to turn, no one left to convince, so I fled. I packed only the essentials, my most sensitive portable detectors, a few changes of clothes, and the printouts of my data, now a collection of condemned prophecies. I drove for hours, the hum of the tires on the asphalt a monotonous drone against the frantic pulse in my temples. My destination was a place I'd never seen, a place my mother had spoken of only in hushed, reverent tones, my grandmother's farmhouse in a village I've never visited. It was remote, tucked away in a valley that seemed to defy the modern world, a pocket of silence I desperately craved. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something something I couldn't quite place, a metallic tang that pricked at the back of my throat. The farmhouse itself was a squat, sturdy structure, its windows like vacant eyes in the gloom. It felt impossibly old, a sentinel against time. I spent the next day calibrating my equipment, setting up a makeshift observation post in the dust-sheeted living room. The detectors, usually so precise, flickered with an unsettling irregularity, their readings oscillating wildly between impossible lows and uninterpretable peaks. It was as if the very fabric of the electromagnetic spectrum was fraying at the edges. This was it. The signal hadn't stopped. It had merely changed its tune, shifting from a distant whisper to an omnipresent hum that only my instruments could truly register. The light began to change first. Not the sun, not the clouds, but the quality of the light itself. It acquired a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer, like heat haze rising from an invisible road, even indoors. I watched my own hand, holding a pen, and saw the shadow of my fingers stretch and distort on the wall, detaching itself for a fleeting moment, a dark, independent entity. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the impression lingered, a smudge on the canvas of reality. Then came the sounds, or rather the lack of them. The familiar creaks of the old house, the distant caw of a crow, the rustle of leaves outside, they began to recede. It was an absorption of sound, as if the air itself had thickened, becoming less capable of transmitting vibrations. I clapped my hands, and the sound was dull, muffled, as if I were underwater. My own footsteps on the wooden floor produced only a faint thud, lacking the sharp resonance I expected. The world was quieting, not gently, but with a deliberate, suffocating intent. I walked to the window, my breath fogging the ancient pain. Outside, the field stretched towards the distant tree line, bathed in that strange, shimmering light. As I watched, its form seemed to waver, its edges blurring, not like a heat mirage, but as if its very definition were being challenged. The cow remained, but its cowness felt less certain, less absolute. It was still there, yet somehow less present, a phantom of its former self. My stomach clenched. I felt a sudden, profound disorientation. The room, which had seemed familiar moments ago, now felt alien. Its texture softened, then hardened, then seemed to invert for a moment, the fabric appearing to be the solid frame and the wood a malleable covering. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. It was an armchair, but the memory of its momentary wrongness persisted, a splinter in my mind. I grasped the edge of a heavy wooden table, my grip tight. The wood felt cool, smooth, solid. Then a subtle vibration began beneath my fingertips, not a tremor, but a fundamental hum, as if the table itself was slowly unmaking its own atomic structure. I snatched my hand back, staring at the grain. The patterns seemed to shift, to rearrange themselves into impossible geometries, tiny, intricate spirals that wound into themselves, then unspooled into meaningless lines. The table was still a table, but the idea of its construction, its fundamental purpose, was dissolving. I backed away, towards the front door, my mind screaming for escape. But escape to where? The world outside was the source of this unraveling. I peered through the narrow crack beneath the door, into the hallway, then out through the small glass panel in the door itself. The sky, it was no longer blue. It wasn't gray either. It was a vast, indifferent expanse of shifting, impossible hues that bled into each other without logic. Colors I had no names for, colors that made my eyes ache with their wrongness, and the stars. Even in the dim light of late afternoon, a few had become visible, pinpricks in the alien sky. But they were wrong. They weren't fixed points. They drifted, not across the sky, but within it, like motes of dust suspended in a viscous, unfeeling medium. Some winked out, not fading, but simply ceasing to be, leaving behind no trace, no lingering light, as if they had never existed. I couldn't hear my own ragged breathing, the frantic thumping of my heart. I was a soundless entity in a soundless world. I pressed my face against the cool glass of the door, desperate to understand, to see what was happening beyond the confines of the farmhouse. The distant hills, once a comforting backdrop, were no longer hills. They were forms, shapes. They rippled, expanding and contracting, their familiar contours twisting into something abstract and jagged. The trees that dotted them stretched upwards, their branches elongating, thinning, then retracting into dense, impenetrable masses. The very concept of up and down began to feel fluid, unreliable. This wasn't destruction. There was no fire, no explosion, no violent tearing apart. This was a reordering, A silent, incomprehensible transformation. Humanity, Earth, everything I had ever known was being recalibrated, adjusted into something utterly alien and indifferent. I was witnessing the Great Correction, an act of cosmic indifference that simply rewrote existence. What would I become when the rules of my own being dissolved? The conversation began with a clipped, professional tone. A familiar shield. I heard the senior figure's voice, calm, measured, asking about my sleep, my recent stress levels. The careful cadence of their words was a wall designed to contain, to dismiss. I tried to explain, to articulate the impossible structure within the signal, the profound, ancient origin. My voice cracked. The line went dead. They hadn't even bothered to hang up. The connection simply dissolved, like a thought too fragile to hold. A cold dread, not of fear but of absolute isolation, settled in my bones. No one would. The world, my world, was still clinging to its comfortable certainties, blind to the encroaching shadows. Not a laboratory, not a city full of indifferent faces, somewhere old, somewhere forgotten. My car ate the miles, the city lights fading into a smear of orange on the horizon. I drove for hours, the hum of the tires on the asphalt, a monotonous counterpoint to the accelerating pulse in my temples. The road signs grew smaller, the names of towns unfamiliar, hinting at forgotten histories. A place where perhaps the world might still be porous enough to let the truth seep in, or perhaps a place where it would be easier to simply cease. The landscape flattened, the trees grew gnarled and sparse, their branches clawing at the bruised twilight sky. The air thickened with the smell of damp earth and decay, a scent that clung to the inside of my nostrils. The engine began to sputter, cough, then a choke, before dying completely on a deserted stretch of road. The stars above were not right. They shivered, their light seeming to bend and waver as if seen through disturbed water. Was it just my eyes, strained and exhausted, or was the fabric of the sky itself beginning to fray? I walked the rest of the way, the map on my phone a useless black mirror. My feet knew the path, guided by some instinct I didn't recognize, through fields that seemed to stretch on forever, past skeletal hedges that rattled in a wind I couldn't feel. The farmhouse appeared suddenly, a silhouette against the distorted starlight, its roof sagging, its windows like vacant eyes. It was smaller than I remembered from old photographs, more dilapidated, almost consumed by the encroaching overgrowth. Watched. The front door groaned open at my touch, releasing a puff of dust motes that danced in the sliver of moonlight. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew, petrichor and something else, something metallic and ancient, like old blood on forgotten stone. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of the wind outside seemed amplified, sharpened, like the world was holding its breath. What was I hoping to find here, in this mausoleum of memory? I moved through the rooms, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The kitchen held a rusted kettle on a stove, a faded calendar from decades past still tacked to the wall. The living room had an armchair, its fabric torn, spilling stuffing like forgotten entrails. But it was the attic that called to me, a faint, almost imperceptible hum seeming to emanate from above. I climbed the narrow, creaking stairs, my hand sliding on the rough banister, splinters digging into my palm. The attic was a trove of forgotten things, trunks filled with yellowed lace, dusty books with crumbling spines, a broken gramophone. But in the center of the room, on a small, unsteady table, sat a collection of my grandmother's old astronomy charts. Not the star maps I knew, but hand-drawn constellations, intricate diagrams that twisted and turned, depicting celestial bodies in impossible configurations. And beneath them, a series of journals, their covers brittle. I opened one. He had seen it too. He had understood. The words blurred, my grandmother's frantic scribblings mirroring my own descent. It wasn't just a signal anymore. It was a presence, a vast, incomprehensible will reshaping reality around us, around me. The pages of the journal began to ripple, the ink shimmering, the words changing before my eyes, shifting into symbols I could almost, but not quite understand. My vision swam. The air in the attic grew heavy, pressing down on me, stealing my breath. The walls pulsed. The entity wasn't just sending a signal, it was the signal. It was the very act of existence, corrected, refined. And I, Marcus, was simply an anomaly, a residual tremor in a newly ordered cosmos. My grandmother's warnings, my own observations, they were not discoveries but symptoms. The humming grew louder, a vibration that resonated not just in my ears, but in my teeth, my bones, the very marrow of my being. The old farmhouse, my last refuge, began to twist. The wooden beams groaned, not with age, but with effort, reshaping themselves. The geometry of the room wavered, the corners softening, the walls bowing inward, then outward, as if breathing a slow, cosmic breath. I felt myself dissolving, my edges blurring. The distinction between my body and the dusty air, between my thoughts and the hum, vanished. My consciousness stretched, thin and fragile, across an infinite expanse. The correction was complete. What remained of me, if anything, was merely a single, faint ripple in a universe that had forgotten the meaning of ripples. What was left to remember?